So first of all, what was your own introduction to British piano music? Was it something that played a really prominent role growing up, or did you come into it later?
Certainly not as I was growing up, and not when I was a student actually. In fact, I studied at the Royal College of Music, and as you know, there's a very rich tradition of English composers there. And they had, for example, a John Ireland Prize, Arthur Bliss Prize, and it never interested me at all, so it was quite a bit later. And we have this wonderful word, serendipity, really, and that's how it all started. I'd started a relationship with some recording label, and the first CD we did was of Italian music, so there was no intention to go down a specific English route. But suddenly, out of the blue, she had a phone call from the Ivor Gurney Society, who were interested in doing a CD of Gurney's piano music. And Siva said, who is the owner of some recordings, well, why don't you look at Mark Bebbington, because we've just done an initial CD of Italian music. And I have to say, I think there was a degree of reticence to start with, because there were an awful lot of pianists who sort of 10 years ago were already very prominent in English music. But anyway, it came about, which was a wonderful opportunity, and I really enjoyed the research that went into quite a lot of the unpublished piano miniatures of Gurney. And it kind of got me hooked, not so much on English music, but on the idea that there can be really wonderful music out there that really is still, even today, not known. And then by chance, the chairman, now the former chairman of the John Ireland Trust, came to hear me shortly after that give a recital in which I was playing some English music. And he came round afterwards to the dressing room and said, would I be interested in recording some of John Ireland's piano music? Well, of course, as we all do, I said, yes, because here looked a striking and very interesting opportunity. And that led really very rapidly to a complete cycle of John Ireland's piano music. But there was no intention to explore this music originally at all. It had not at all been in my plans. But I do remember very strikingly during the recording sessions that both I and also Siva Oak, who was producing, there was a real sense of how wonderful this music was and how staggering it was that it was so little known. And we both felt this sort of palpable excitement that we were involved in a project to record really significant music that couldn't possibly say was a first, but hadn't been recorded for maybe 40 or 50 years. So it was a wonderful feeling.
I think serendipitous is the perfect word to describe not only your own sort of introduction to this music, but for most people, I think, who come across this music, it is largely by happy accident.
Absolutely.
But in terms of your own initial attachment to it, what was it in particular that drew you to this repertoire, or once you discovered it, that you thought was so special or so unique about it?
Well, I was very taken with a particular theme in Gurney's music, which I think in many ways that CD in Gurney as a composer is the one that sort of has attached himself to me in a way more significantly than any of the others. And that's, I think there is, if there is such a thing as an ongoing theme through much of English music of a certain period, it's a strand of particularly English melancholy that I think you can trace through all of the art forms. It's there in the literature of a particular period, it's there in the visual arts, and in the music it binds together a particular way of looking at an aspect of Englishness, if you like. And it's very, very prominent in the music of Ivor Gurney. And I do remember particularly one of the miniatures that was unpublished, and I think is still unpublished, Sehnsucht, Longing, where a very young Ivor Gurney had clearly used a German noun to describe what would have been almost a very difficult state to describe at that time, longing. But the emotional fragility of this piece is remarkable in one so young. And that being a reflection of his own mental state and as we know, the mental instability that plagued him for the rest of his life, that should have come through at such a young stage. I mean, he wrote this when he was a late teenager, was really, really striking. And I still think that there's something about those miniatures, his ability to describe an emotional state that goes beyond being merely sad. One really senses something of the man behind these early notes. And I was very, very taken with that. And also as well in a subjective way, I remember going to Gloucester Library with the then chairman of the Gurney Trust and looking through these manuscripts and thinking, you know, so few people have seen these. And there is a palpable feeling that of discovery. And I could see then that so much of this material was so good, and yet at the same time a lot of it was uneven, which again is a reflection, alas, of his mental state. But the best of it I found really, really moving. So I think this strand of melancholy certainly binds together one aspect, but only one, because when we came across Arthur Bliss, and I was asked to record Bliss's piano music, which is again really one area of his output which is almost completely neglected. But there were 2 CDs worth of music, and a lot of it is wonderful. And the early stuff, which hadn't been ever performed before, was particularly fascinating, seeing how the influence there of Stravinsky in particular comes through in his music. So you're not talking of that same kind of melancholy, but on the other hand, the really moving thing with Bliss was to come across the suite from 1925, which has that extraordinary slow movement, which doesn't have bar lines. And it's just the sort of inner exploration of the desolation that he felt on the death of his brother in the Great War, and in fact everyone who had perished in the Great War. And the fact that Bliss himself had been in the Great War and had been injured and suffered, along with millions of others, gives the music a particular poignancy and also immediacy. But I was very struck with the way how that translated into music that's much more acerbic, not at all heart-searching and trying to console in the way that Gurney does. So it's partly the element of contradiction that exists within so much of this music that is so fascinating. And still some people, some critics and interviewees who I've had over the years have said, oh, we don't like British music. And to me, that's a statement almost like saying, well, you know, I don't like Austrian German music. I don't like Haydn, Beethoven or Schubert. You can't dismiss music which is as rich as British music in the way that some people do. It's because they think that they pigeonholed it as one particular category. But in fact, as we know, the more you get to know it, the greater the richness of all of these categories, and the more difficult it is to actually pin it down, which is where its richness is.
I want to return to the earlier part of your career, in particular the point after you left the Royal College of Music and you studied abroad with Aldo Cicciolini. And I'm curious to know at that stage if British music played any role in your life abroad, and if so, what was the sort of reaction to?
No, it didn't. But interestingly enough, I'd studied at the Royal College of Music with as it was termed at that time, sort of one of the gods. There were 2 or 3 very renowned teachers, and I was fortunate enough to study over a 4-year period with 2 of them, both of whom had very significant part in the development of British music, and the one in particular who I was very, very attached to and who I had much to do with until she died actually not that many years ago, Phyllis Selleck. She was instrumental in having works by Vaughan Williams, Arthur Bliss, Malcolm Arnold written for her, and Tippett in particular, his first piano sonata was written for her. And so I suppose in a subliminal way I was aware of the fact that British music played a very significant part in the establishing of a career of these pianists. and many of them, I also remember as well talking at the end of his life to Sir Clifford Curzon, who was, probably the greatest pianist, British pianist of that particular generation, saying that he had played Sarnia a lot of John Ireland as a younger man, and going through all the Alan Rawsthorne works that he'd played. But I think what tended to happen is that as they became more well known internationally, then their greater demand was to hear them playing Schubert and Chopin and Beethoven, and so they tended to neglect English composers, not because they wanted to, but simply because I think the demands of an international career meant that there was greater emphasis that had to be put elsewhere. So somewhere ticking in my mind was that to get a career going, it's actually not a bad idea to try and cultivate an area of the repertoire which is perhaps neglected in any case. And when I studied in Italy with Aldo Ciccolini, he had been renowned for his performances of French music, and in particular he'd established an international vogue for Satti's music. Was the first pianist ever to record and play Satti. So he had been very keen on the idea that every pianist that has to sort of identify themselves in the marketplace, as it were. And so British music, by the happiest of coincidences, was a very useful tool in doing that for me. But it was far more than that. I found the riches, and still do, of the music take it far beyond the interest of it just being a career opportunity.
I'd like to pivot to the subject of teaching. We're speaking in the Royal Birmingham Conservatoire at the moment, where you are, of course, on the piano faculty, and I'm curious to know what role, if any, British piano music has played in your work as a teacher, whether it's with British students or with international students.
Perhaps paradoxically, it's the international students that show greater interest in it, and quite a few of them, I think, study with me because they want to learn either specific English works or just to know a little bit more about the cultural background of this country, which seems to me to be a very good thing to be doing when you're coming as an international student and spending maybe just 2 or 3 years over here. I do get some English students that are very open and alive to looking at English music. Again, I think because they realise that it's something that's has been a big part and still remains a significant part of what I do. So I think the good thing about the young students is they are, on the whole, very open-minded. And I think the better students, if I may use that term, or the students who have more than an eye on developing a performing career, are very aware of the fact that there are so many wonderful talents out there at every stage of pianist development, that in fact to try and cultivate something for oneself that is less known is a very, very good way forward in any case. So quite a few of them come with a degree of interest that's heightened because of that. Then, in quite a number of cases, they've discovered just how wonderful the music is. And I know that they talk to one another, of course, and so it becomes interesting to see how maybe a composer at the moment, John Ireland, is clearly, as it were, doing the rounds at the Conservatoire. The number of performances this year in exams of John Ireland's music is very high, which is good to see. So, and I think it's just because, one student learns a work and then they play it to another student and they say, gosh, this is good stuff, interesting. And then, so it's like a sort of a system of communication that exists between them.
In my mind, this proliferation of British music amongst the students is one of the things that is special about the Birmingham Conservatoire, and that can't be said about every musical institution in this country. There is a tendency for British music to be overlooked in the curriculum for college conservatory level students. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think we've been very fortunate here in having had Julian Lloyd-Webber for maybe 5 or 6 years, and his, of course, very obvious devotion to English music in his own performing career. And not in any superficial or career way, a real love of the music and an ability to take that onto an international level. So, you know, his performances of the Delius Cello Concerto and Delius Cello Sonata, you know, have been played in pretty well every country in the world. And I know that just before he left, we were instrumental in putting together the Delius Prize, because he felt very importantly that, you know, Delius should be represented here. So his own involvement in trying to encourage English music and doing everything he could in the way of establishing a big festival, which alas, you know, this COVID period has put paid to, that was a very, very significant factor. But it's strange that both the Royal Academy, for example, and Royal College, which has such a wonderful pedigree of composers, that they should not be as alive to the importance of that. But perhaps there is more of an element in these institutions which in a way form the backbone of the English establishment. And I remember as my tiny bit anarchic history professor, wonderful, wonderful man at the Royal College of Music, would say that, you know, the drawback, the advantage, but also the drawback of a traditional conservatoire is inherent in the name, conserve. And if all you're doing is conserving a tradition, but you're not challenging it, then you're unlikely to be able to produce maybe some of the more interesting composers that, for example, Britten and Tippett, both at the Royal College of Music. Britten famously said that he had to leap over fences which he would otherwise have walked through had he not studied at the Royal College of Music. Which is, you know, it's just about the fact that it was conservative. And I do wonder whether there is a remnant of that even today in the way that teaching and repertoire is viewed. I would imagine not a great deal, but I can imagine that there would be a vestige of that. Whereas here, particularly the way that we've leapt forward in our reputation over the last 5 or 6 years, in a sense, you know, we come without that historical basis.
In addition to all these recordings that you've done of British music for the Psalm label and Resonance and others, you're also an extremely busy performer and
yes.
working with live audiences. And what role does British music play in that context? And in particular, how do audiences typically respond to these things? Because sometimes you're not only playing solo concerts and chamber concerts, but audiences also get to hear you play these enormous masterpieces, piano concertos, the Delius piano concerto, the John Ireland piano concerto. How does all this relate to the audience?
On the whole, very positively, I have to say. But I tend to know the composers which will really win appreciative audiences. And on the whole, for example, John Ireland's piano music will always go down well. And the advantage of a composer like John Ireland is it will go very well with French music in a second half, where you can finish with Liszt or Chopin, and it will, as it were, accommodate itself very well into any one of a number of contexts. But it's great to have feedback when audiences say, we didn't know that music, but we think it was amazing. And you tend to get to know after a little bit of experience which of the works within each composer will be the winner. And I think the thing to do is, if initially we're all looking to get the audience online for this music, so the thing is to concentrate on those works which are definitely going to have an element of audience appreciation. Although strangely enough, last week I did a recital at St John Smith Square and played quite a lot of contemporary music, including the first performance of a work by Robert Matthew Walker, who we all know very well, and 2 works by him actually, and the level of concentration in the audience on that occasion was palpable. And I was actually finishing the programme with some John Ireland, a real sort of, as it were, showstopper. And I remember thinking, something was going through my mind as I was playing the Bob Matthew Walker. I could tell the effect it was having on the audience. And I remember thinking, John Ireland's going to have a hard time after this. And yet that was entirely unexpected. And it's interesting that the press notices we had afterwards very much echoed that. Not a criticism of John Ireland at all, but just on that particular occasion, he had almost been knocked for six by the emotional impact of the music that had come before. And yet that hadn't been something which I had spotted to quite that degree in my preparation of the music, but it happened on stage. So that's always something that's very interesting when it happens. I also think that it's been wonderful to have the chance of playing some of these concertos. I mean, the Delius Concerto, which I'm playing, hopefully, next year, which I think has been postponed twice by the RPO because of COVID. But we do have a date, I think it's 2023, to do it again in London. And recording that and preparing that was just such a joy, because I don't think it's a masterpiece throughout, but there are moments in it that are so beautiful that it's worth playing alone for those wonderful moments. I mean, it's much more than that, but it's wonderful to get the chance of playing that and thinking that this is a work that won't have actually been heard in London for maybe 60 or 65 years. And the same so with the John Ireland Piano Concerto, which I played in London 2 or 3 years ago, and this was a work which, above all of any British piano concerto, was popular. I mean, it was almost standard repertoire. Well, it was standard repertoire. And there was a period in the proms from about late 1930s up until mid-1960s when it was there almost every season, and sometimes twice in the same season. And if you think that probably the greatest, well, in my opinion, probably the greatest pianist of the 20th century, Arthur Rubinstein, made his debut at the proms playing the John Ireland Piano Concerto. That gives you an indication of how important the work was. There's no way that Rubinstein would have said he was going to give his name to a British composer and a British piano concerto unless it was totally and utterly at the kind of career expectation that he would have had. And I know he very much wanted to record it. But that just wasn't possible because I think a clash of difficulties with his recording label. But it shows that there was a period when I think a lot of British piano concertos were in the armoury of every very well-known British pianist and some foreign ones. The great Greek pianist Gina Bakova was renowned for her performance of the Bliss Piano Concerto. Now that's one of the towering great British piano concertos, and one which I very much hope to be recording and playing in the next year. And it's very interesting, the story behind that. I mean, it was written for the Festival of Britain and written for Carnegie Hall and written for Solomon, who was then our greatest of great pianists, a fantastic player. But it starts with a fuselage of double octaves that continues for about a page. And there's no chance for a pianist to get his hands warmed up. There's a bar of introduction and you are in with this ferociously difficult writing. And Bliss said that Solomon, who gave such an unbelievable first performance of it that we now have on disc, was so terrified that he had to be pushed on stage by Sir Adrian Boult, who was the conductor, because it has such a treacherous opening. And the few pianists that have played it all say, gosh, it's those blazing octaves at the beginning that set the scene for a real virtuoso showcase. So that's a work which should be heard a lot more and should appeal to sort of every virtuoso pianist of every nationality. I think we're getting there. We're getting there. I mean, if you think of the number of recordings that are available now of this music, that's fantastically encouraging. But I have to say that with the exception of maybe 2 or 3 festivals in this country, of which, for example, 3 Choirs, which is the oldest festival in Europe and is a kind of carrier of the flame of British music, and in particular of the great choral tradition, cathedral tradition that we have in this country. that and one or two festivals aside, it's sometimes quite difficult to sell British music to promoters. And that's why it's wonderful that there are trusts such as the John Island Trust, the Bliss Trust. Most British composers have a financial tag attached to them, which enables them to be able to support their composer's music, because there is still a feeling that, and unfortunately I think it may be true, that if the Festival Hall, if the London Phil or the Royal Phil was to put on even the most popular Bach's symphony, it might not do terribly well from an audience point of view. But it's likely to do very well at a festival like the Three Choirs, because that's renowned for gathering together audiences who are aficionados of English music. So I can sympathise entirely with the reticence that some promoters have in pushing too strong a case for English music. And I have had, even this year and next year, one or two promoters that are establishing festivals that are given over, in one case, to a weekend, 3 concerts of English music. And it is a box office risk. There's no doubt about it. It's a wonderful artistic idea. But there is still a little bit of a problem sometimes in selling the music to, as it were, the public that will come to a recital or a concert of a Schubert symphony or a Beethoven piano sonata. But I think that's why I think it's the job of the performer to assess how much and at what level of revealing of English music to give, which is why I think, for example, some of John Island's music is great for a starter audience, because it has the wow factor, and they're saying afterwards, gosh, we didn't realise how wonderful this music is. So one has to use an element of judgment all the way along the line.
In terms of the marketability of British music, and also how one can interest concert organizers in this repertoire, we have to mention the elephant in the room, which is we're speaking in June 2021, and we've been through a worldwide pandemic, and that has had a huge effect on all of the classical industry. And how has it affected British music in either positive or negative ways in terms of opening up the possibility, possible venues for this, or outlets for this repertoire?
I would say British music has scored quite well, actually, paradoxically, I think, because an awful lot of the works that I've been involved in are scored for a relatively small number of players. So it's been possible for me to record, for the BBC, for example, has been very supportive of English music. And I've done Rawsthorne Piano Concerto and Finzi Eclogue. I've done quite a lot, because it works. The idea of strings only is perfect for a lockdown situation. And quite a lot of William Elwyn's music as well. Chamber music is just written for that magic number of 18 or below. If it goes above 18, you can't really either record it or play it in concert. And English composers have very happily often written music that just comes below that. So it's been a wonderful opportunity for a lot of English music to be heard on the radio, which is wonderful, because that's a wonderful propagator of this music. And perhaps as well an opportunity for British artists as well to be able to step forward, because international travel has been so difficult for foreign artists. So it's been a very happy coming together of a fusion of lots of elements, strangely enough, to this period. Although I'm bound to say that I've also explored French music as well, and there are some of the works of Poulenc which I played. Again, this wonderful work, Aubade, is written for 18 players. It was the perfect choice to record, because no other concert hall in London, nowhere in the UK could go above 18 players, but we were able to play it in concert and to record it. So French music aside, though, English music does score very, very well on that level.
So for listeners to this interview who may be at an earlier stage in their career, college or before, who have an interest, maybe in British music or maybe not, but in any case they have an interest in carving out a career for themselves, What would you say to them?
Well, it is an astonishingly difficult thing to do, and I think that it's doing a disservice to any young fledgling pianist, no matter how talented they are, really to say otherwise. And I think that the maturer students are very, very, very aware of that. I think the difficulty of the paths that we all choose is that every way forward is different. If you want to become a dentist or a doctor or a banker or a solicitor, there's a certain track that you have to go down, and you have to jump over, certain hurdles, and you go through certain hoops to achieve exams. But by and large, you're on a trajectory which has been established by countless number of people before you. If you're looking to become a pianist, and this term concert pianist, if you talk to any currently performing pianist, the way in which they have achieved what they have achieved and are continuing to achieve what they're achieving, each route will be totally different. So it's extremely difficult to be able to give any advice to a college student, be they pianist or violinist, because I think necessarily the big factor is they have to have the curiosity to want to carve something out for themselves. And I think a curiosity as well to be questioning all the time. I mean, as pianists, for example, we almost take it as a given and as a read that the 32 Beethoven sonatas are absolute masterpieces, and we study them. We studied the Bach 48 for first year exams, the Chopin studies. I think we all need to question, why is it that we're doing this, and are they all masterpieces? And is it, it's almost sacrilegious to say that maybe one or two of the Beethoven sonatas are less good, but perhaps we should be encouraging one another to question a lot more the notion of this idea of tradition. Why is it that we all play the same music? Why is it that we gravitate to the same few Beethoven piano sonatas? When you listen to what's going on in the practice room here, I'll guarantee you're only going to hear 5 Beethoven sonatas. What's wrong with the other 27? There's a natural tendency. The Chopin ballades will always be in the forefront of what a pianist wants to do. I understand that they are masterpieces, but there are other wonderful works by neglected 19th, 20th century romantic composers that I think we should be encouraging our students to look at. I think to be alive musically and intellectually and questioning at every stage is a really healthy sign if you're wanting to establish a career.
So, as we both know, British music is this incredibly rich and diverse repertoire. There's just so much there, and these composers who've been dead for decades just seem to keep writing more music for us to perform and discover. Mm-hmm. And for people who are new to this repertoire and want to learn more about it, you've done, what would you recommend? You've done so many recordings. Are there one or two or three in particular you might recommend as good sort of introductions to British piano music?
Well, I think if I could select 10 minutes worth of music, which I think is sublime, and if I were a composer, I would say, gosh, I would like to have written that. It would be the Finzi Eclogue, which I think as a means of introducing any audience to the best of a particular strand of Englishness, there's nothing better than that. And it is a piece which it's as though an English composer why is it that it is so redolent of the English countryside? Where I live, I mean, I live very close to one of the most beautiful parts of the country. And it's as though it summons the quality of the Englishness of the landscape of this country, but with the purity of J.S. Bach. It's almost as though Gurney had met on a walk J.S. Bach and they'd had a conversation. And the purity of that conversation, the purity of Bach's lines comes through in this music in such a sublime way. It's a perfect masterpiece. And I think for anyone who is interested in music and interested in anything to do with culture in this country, that's a perfect way into it. After that, if you're a pianist, gosh, I'd say explore the unbelievable piano sonata of Benjamin Dale, which is such an astonishing work and such an astonishing history. There was this composer, B.J. Dale, who started this piano sonata, which is, I think, 53 minutes long. And it's so astonishingly ambitious for one so young, and very nearly completely successful. But the reviews that he got after he'd written this were that not since Brahms in his Opus 1 have we been so excited by an early work. And the tragedy is that that enormous impetus at the beginning of his career was not sustained. Whether there was a breakdown or something, or a complete loss of confidence, but there's nothing in his output that to me equals the excitement of that. And if you're a pianist, listen to the first movement of the B.J. Dale Sonata and say, isn't this, wow, so exciting. I mean, it's like listening to early Scriabin or Rachmaninoff. It's in that idiom. And this is a work which actually every great British pianist of that period was premiered, I think, by Dame Myra Hess, who was, the legendary pianist who set up the National Gallery concerts decades after that. But Museevich, one of the great émigré pianists who settled in London, he played it. Clifford Curzon played it. Latterly, and that's going back 30, 40 years, Dame Maura Limpany, one of the last great pianists, took it into her repertoire. And that is such a great piece. I'd say to every virtuoso pianist, look at that, because it's wonderful music. To anyone who's interested in French music, look at John Ireland, the best of John Ireland, because it's like French music with a wonderfully English melancholy to it, really. And I suppose in some ways a composer who we've almost not talked about, who in some ways is musically the most fascinating of all, is Frank Bridge, because of these three periods that he went through. The development, the early style, which is very French, and where the British musical establishment was patting him on the head saying, oh, you're one of ours, what a great chap you are. Then moving off and coming under the influence of the Second Viennese school, the music of Alban Berg and Webern. And then the British establishment got mighty suspicious of Frank Bridge, who was not behaving as he should have done. And then the poor man being neglected because of that. And then in the final stage, writing these wonderful experimental works, including the last piano work, and I think possibly the last work he ever wrote, Gargoyle, which is astonishing work. And the ignominy that he was refused publication of that work. And it's just unbelievable to think that there could have been that degree of prejudice because he wouldn't conform. And yet we look back now at the richness of a creative life that was so influenced by much more than a sense of what the English establishment expected him to be. But I think that's a stark reminder of how, in some ways, narrow-minded parts of the establishment could be during that period. So I would say almost look anywhere and you will find, if you have open mind and open ears, you'll find riches in abundance in this repertoire. It's staggeringly good.